marks the beginning of three major events. That's today. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem and his crucifixion at the end of the week. The third major event, well, we'll talk about that next week. But talk about ambivalence, the ambivalence of this week, holding all the tension of jubilation and the deep grief of pain and suffering. For the next 2 weeks, we will be telling the story of Jesus from his disciples' perspective. There is no greater story for humanity than what we're going to be telling this morning. Whether you're a believer in Jesus Christ or someone who is curious but not yet a believer, we invite you this morning to let the words of Scripture soak into your mind today. We will be telling stories from those who are there. And so it begins for us this morning. Our stage isn't quite big enough to hold a donkey. But that's exactly what Jesus rode into Jerusalem on. We'll have to use our imaginations this morning. So imagine with me, the people were so excited that they waved palm branches, laying them in front of the donkey as he rode in. They were singing, they rejoiced loudly, crazily. He was fulfilling the scripture in Zechariah 9:9.
Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey.
Jesus' triumphant entrance into Jerusalem was because of his popularity. His popularity had grown to the point of speculation that when he would enter Jerusalem, he would overthrow the Roman government and free the Jews from yet one more regime that they were in bondage to. They had not really understood what Zechariah was talking about. Jesus knew all of that. He knew that they would be confused and angry. He knew that they would wrestle with all of their emotions. Some would remain and get it, and yet others would let their anger fuel them. He knew that there would be many who would still stay so focused on their religious beliefs that it would keep them from seeing the truth. He knew that their rejection of God's invitation for repentance and salvation would now be ending a journey with Israel, and it would be given to others. He also knew that what he would have to endure was not because they would accept that he was the Messiah. It was because they were rejecting him. And those that wouldn't believe, they would be left with no hope, no peace, no joy, and no forgiveness. Jesus was the only one crying that Palm Sunday, while the others were whooping it up in jubilation. Listen to how Luke talks about that moment in Luke 19:37 through 44.
As soon as he got to the bottom of the Mount of Olives, the crowd of his followers shouted with loud outbursts of ecstatic joy over all the mighty wonders of power that they had witnessed. They shouted over and over, "Highest praises to God for the one who comes as king in the name of the Lord. Heaven's peace and glory from the highest realm now come to us." Some of the Jewish religious leaders who stood off from the procession said to Jesus, "Teacher, order your followers to stop saying these things." But Jesus responded, "Listen to me. If my followers were silenced, the very stones would break forth with praises. When Jesus caught sight of the city, he burst into tears with uncontrollable weeping over Jerusalem, saying, "If only you could recognize that this day peace is within your reach, but you cannot see it. For the day is soon coming when your enemies will surround you, hem you in on every side, and lay siege to you. They will crush you to pieces, and your children too. They will leave your city totally destroyed. Since you would not recognize God's day of visitation, you will see your day of devastation."
Once coming into Jerusalem, Jesus headed straight to the temple. And what he found in the temple courts was mind-blowing. People had set up mini stores to sell merchandise to make money for themselves, and making a mockery of God and his sacred temple. Jesus quoted from Isaiah and Jeremiah about what the temple was meant for.
The scriptures declare, "My Father's house will be filled with prayer, a house of prayer, and not a cave of bandits."
Jesus was declaring in that moment that their hearts had grown cold and sick. How dare they desecrate and misuse God's holy place to make money? Jesus flipped tables and he threw them out of the temple. From the temple courts, he went into the temple and he taught. The high priest couldn't find any reason to accuse him of heresy, and they continually tried to trip him up, but it never worked. The Pharisees also saw how the people hung on his every word. The religious leaders were scared and terrified of the message that Jesus was preaching. I mean, he was declaring that there was more to serving God than just the 10 Commandments. He was after more. He also was God in the flesh. The religious leaders wanted obedience, not only to the 10 Commandments, but to all the other rules that they had created. Jesus was preaching that God was after their hearts. That obedience wasn't enough. The high priest became furious and intensified their plotting against Jesus. Jesus continued preaching. He taught in the temple, and he taught the people with vigor and a passion, filling in what will happen in the future. He told them what the religious leaders were trying to do by hiding the truth. And he told them that they would need to guard their hearts from growing cold and weighed down with hopelessness. He spoke to his disciples, instructing them as a man whose life was about to end on earth. You know, he knew that these were his last moments on earth, and that they were going to need to know things, to understand what was happening. In fact, there were so many more parables and lessons that he taught during this week. And each day, he taught in the temple, and at night he would spend on the Mount of Olives. As the celebration of Passover was coming to a culmination, the Jewish religious leaders continued scheming to find a way to kill Jesus. Jesus, on the other hand, was busy. He was preparing his disciples for his departure from this world and to help them understand what was about to happen. And he knew that they would partly understand now. He also began planning for the Last Supper he would have with them. These men that he had been discipling for the last 3.5 years, it must have been really bittersweet for him. It was here at the Last Supper, the night before Passover, that Jesus began the evening by washing the disciples' feet. You know, only a servant would stoop to that position, washing stinky feet. The disciples totally missed the point. They were concerned only about themselves because they were arguing about who was the greatest among them. But that evening, they broke bread together, and Jesus continued to teach them about what was going to be transpiring in the following days. The disciples had no clue what he was saying about his body, his blood. So much happened in those moments with the disciples. Jesus knew that his time was drawing very short with these men that he chose and loved. Jesus prophesies of Peter's denial. Satan enters Judas, and they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. But let's hear from a couple of his followers. First, we'll hear from Judas, the holder of the money.
Hey, please, I just need somebody to talk to. Hey, just hear me out, okay? I really didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just trying to move things along and maybe make a little money on the way. I kept track of the purse for the disciples, which included money made from donations and fishing, and things were always tight. I admit, I occasionally dipped my hand into the pot, but only when I really needed it. So when I heard that the high priest was offering money for anyone who would give them Jesus, I asked him about it. After a fair amount of negotiation, we decided on 30 pieces of silver. 5 weeks' wages for a single man. I knew that they couldn't catch Jesus. He was the Messiah, the Son of God. No mortal could ever catch him. At dinner, Jesus announced that someone would betray him. Of course, I joined in, saying, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." His reply, "You have said it yourself." After dinner, I was pretty shaken up. But a deal's a deal. So I went to the high priest and got ready. We had a signal. The man who I kissed on the cheek was Jesus. When we got to the garden, I saw Jesus telling his disciples something. I'm not sure what he was saying, but I'm afraid it was about me. I walked up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and gave him a kiss. And his response shook me to the core. He said, "Do what you came for, friend." But just as he said that, the mob came. The priests came to take him away, and he didn't even fight them. They dragged him off into the night. At that moment, I knew that I had made a terrible mistake. I ran back to the temple to give the money back. I begged the priests to take it back since they had betrayed an innocent man. Their response? "That's your problem," they said. They couldn't take it back since it was blood money. They could give it up, but they couldn't take it back? I threw the coins to the ground and ran away. I thought he would be the Messiah who came to make everything right. Where did it all go wrong? You believe me, right? You have to believe me. I didn't mean for him to die. I don't know how this will end. And I don't plan on being around to see it.
Now let's hear from Peter.
My name is Peter. Yes, that Peter. The one who just kind of blurts things out. Maybe the one who doesn't always think about what he does before he does it or the repercussions. You see, Jesus and I, we walked together for several years. And let me tell you, it has been one heck of adventure. I'm a fisherman by trade, and I have found myself in uncharted waters. Everything has been turned upside down. This right here, this is the garden where it all fell apart. It's a place of hopelessness. It was the night he was betrayed, and I'll never forget it. Ugh. You see, right over here, this is where we fell asleep when he asked us to pray. And right over here, this is where Jesus was kneeling when the guards came and they took him. They grabbed him. They tried to take my Jesus from me. I came in from this direction. I had my sword on me. I said, this is my time. I'm going to show them who's boss. I took my sword and I cut off the priest's servant's ear. It came right off. Oh, I didn't even think twice. Way to go, Peter. Reacting exactly like Jesus told us not to. Using violence. And you know what he did? Jesus went over and he picked up that man's ear and he put it right back on his head like it'd been there the whole time. That's what he did. He always did stuff like that, fixing everybody's messes. He loved people so well. That night, they took him from the garden, and I said I didn't even know him. I denied him. 3 times. 3 times I denied him. My friend, the man who I watched perform miracles, the man who I broke bread with, the man I traveled with, the man who washed my feet. I denied him. And the worst part is he told me I was going to do it too. He said it was going to happen just like it did. And you know what I did? I argued with him like a fool. Oh, what a fool I was. But he was right. He's always right. And now, he's probably going to die. And it's my fault. I should have done more. I should have listened. I knew this was going to happen. He knew this was going to happen. Why didn't I listen? I never even got to say I was sorry. Oh, Peter, you really screwed up this time. You know, I didn't mean to betray him. I didn't mean to lie. I didn't want to get hurt. I didn't want to hurt anybody else. I didn't want to go to prison. I didn't want to die. You know, back when we were in Philippi, Jesus told me something, and I'll never forget it. He told me that I was the rock which the church was going to be built upon. Some rock I am. I can't even stick up for my Lord when a servant girl asks me about him. Do you think there's still hope for me? Jesus, if you can hear me, please forgive me. If you're still alive, please forgive me. I'm so full of things that I'm ashamed of. I just want to get back in the boat with you one last time. Please, Jesus, empty my cup. Fill it with you. I need less of me. I need more of you.
It's a whirlwind after the garden. Jesus is brought before Pilate, the Roman governor. But Pilate realizes there's a problem with sentencing an innocent man. So he sees a way out because Jesus is from a different region. So he sends him to Antipas, the son of Herod. you remember Herod. He's the guy who tried to kill, or he did kill babies when Jesus was born. He was trying to kill Jesus. Well, all Antipas did was mock Jesus, putting a purple robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. All the while, Jesus stayed quiet. He knew the power that resided in him. He knew that these next moments would change history. His story. It changed my story. Well, there were already 3 men slotted to be hung that day. So it would mean that they would have to make room for Jesus. But Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, decided to try and offer a bribe or a trade. Jesus for Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was an evil man. He had robbed, he had murdered, and he'd been convicted. Pilate was hoping that the people would want an innocent man roaming the streets rather than a murderer. But they chose to have Barabbas instead. Pilate had Jesus beaten. Every whip and scourging of his body was so deep and so substantial that by the end he was unrecognizable. Pilate had been warned by his wife, who had been tormented by nightmares about this. He did not want to have Jesus killed. He knew he was innocent. It makes me wonder if on some level Pilate knew Jesus was who he said he was. The Jewish leaders insisted Jesus be killed. So Pilate said, "I can't find any reason to kill this man. So here is your king of the Jews." They placed a crown of thorns on his head, his body depleted of all the energy and physical strength. They demanded he carry the cross. If it had not been for Simon of Libya, he would not have had the strength to make it all the way to the cross. But I think it might help us to hear a different perspective from the mother of Jesus, Mary.
Of course, I was there. I watched every moment. It's the hardest thing for a mom ever have to do. But if through his swollen, blackened eyes, he looked down from that cross, darkened by the shadow of the crucifixion, I wanted to make sure he saw the face of someone who loved him. And he did. I almost broke down. His eyes met mine. The eyes that looked up at me from that hay-filled manger. The eyes that brimmed with tears as I cleaned his skinned elbow. The eyes that read the scrolls in the synagogue. Those eyes that looked over Jerusalem and wept. His eyes that saw every need, every wound, every hurt, every sinful soul, and he refused to look away. I knew long ago he was meant for a purpose. When you're visited by an angel, you start to understand that this baby you're carrying might be something more. When the shepherds come to kneel at his makeshift cradle, a mother suspects that her baby's life will be not an ordinary one. Wise men came bringing gifts worth more money than we can make in a carpenter's shop in a year. A mom knows. A mom should know that Yahweh has planned bigger than she can wrap her mind around. When a mom finds her 12-year-old explaining the law and the prophets to the greatest teachers in Jerusalem, she can be fairly certain that there's something different in store for this boy. When your son looks into your face and he says, I have to be about my father's business, something in your heart tells you he's not talking about the carpenter shop. Your heart skips a beat with the realization that the road that your son is going to have is not easy. When your son transforms plain water into the finest wine, when he restores sight, heals the lame, even raises the dead, a mother knows that this proves the divine intention beyond his birth. These are moments I've treasured in my heart. But a mother will worry. I did. And I have. The more attention he draws to himself, the more the authorities threaten and whisper. The more I find myself just wishing he would just come back to the carpenter shop and just live a simple life. He's quite a good carpenter, you know. From the time Joseph started teaching him his skills, he worked hard to master them. And I love to watch him work. Pounding, sawing, sanding, making tables, chairs, bowls, ladles. And then, when each one matched the plan that he had sketched on his parchment, he would wipe away the dust, step back, spread his arms, smile, and say 3 simple words. 3 words that were a declaration of his completion. I heard those words again today. A mom knows. I knew that they meant so much the same thing, and though infinitely magnified, there was no furniture, no houseware this time. But still, there was a plan stretched out and in place since before my son was formed in my womb, and I suspect for much longer. Today on that cross, his arms spread. I am almost positive that I saw on that bruised, wounded, blood-covered face, beyond belief, a smile. And I knew before he said them the words that were going to come next. It is finished. But a mom knows things. It is finished. Yes, without a doubt. But it isn't over.
We know that the story has only just begun. As we enter this week of remembering, we think about the impact of all that Jesus did for us. Where do you find yourself? Do you find yourself with Judas? Or maybe Peter? Maybe you find yourself with Pilate, knowing that Jesus was a good man, that he didn't deserve all that happened to him, but you feel powerless and hopeless to make changes in your life. If you're a believer, you're tempted to rush through this week because you know what happens next week. But if we do that, we may miss all that the Spirit of God has for us in the waiting week. Grieving as Peter grieved, knowing that he had betrayed Jesus, even with something that we might call minor today. I mean, hey, we might get persecuted. What would people say about us? What if I really doubt my beliefs, or I feel my sin is too great for Jesus to forgive? We sometimes miss that Jesus still called Judas friend when he kissed his cheek. What could this week look like for you to contemplate, to wonder about all that had to take place in order for you and me to receive the ultimate forgiveness? So much happened during Jesus' last week on earth. Could it be that in this week, God has something to speak to each one of us? Waiting is hard. Waiting is hard work. We'd much rather be joyful and happy. So what could it look like? Slowed down and thought about it. Maybe God's stirring something in your heart this morning and something pricked you. Wonder about it. Become curious. And then join us next week as we tell the rest of the story. Next week, we will begin our time together with a breakfast at 8:30. You are all invited. Everyone online, everyone here, you're all invited. And that's how we're going to begin next week. So join us. And thank you for being here.